Today, you get to hear a phenomenal discussion with Roy Zwahlen. This was recorded in front of a live remote audience in Zion Lab. If you haven't joined us over at Zion Lab, today's the day. We have some phenomenal discussions and recordings like this that you can participate in. Now, Roy is an attorney. He's an entrepreneur. He's an academic. He's a thought leader. Recently wrote a book called Race to Innovation, and obviously a more for secular business. However, there's phenomenal principles that he has researched that are worth discussing in the context of the church and leading in the church or being a Zion builder. Now, you might think of the concept of innovation as, man, it doesn't seem like it's a perfect fit in the restored gospel or in a religious tradition or experience. However, we believe in an ongoing restoration. We believe in inspiration and revelation. We believe that we've covenanted in the temple to use our abilities to build the kingdom of God. So what does that mean? Like, how do we actually implement that? What if we have a good idea, but we don't have anywhere to take it to, or nobody wants to get behind us with it, or we feel inspired in this passion to move a certain direction, and maybe in the context of a ward or outside the ward? What do we do with this? What does it mean to be a Zion builder? And this is a phenomenal discussion to really help you find a place to start creating and building the kingdom of God as you've covenanted to do. So Roy shares his 5 principles of innovation, which creates some interesting discussion, and we get a few comments from the listening audience as well. But I think this is well worth a listen and well worth talking about, whether with a ward council, with a group of friends, with other Zion builders who feel like, I feel like I can make a difference. I just don't know where to start or what that looks like. So let's jump into it. Here's my interview with Roy Zwahlen. All right, welcome to another episode. Here I am with a live remote audience on Zion Lab, and we're chatting with Roy Zwahlen today. How are you, Roy?
I'm well, thank you.
Cool. And maybe just give us a quick summary of your background. And I love guys like you with some, leadership background as far as, being a thought leader or wrestling over some of these principles as they relate to leadership. But yeah, give us your background.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm an attorney by training. I like to joke that I'm a reformed attorney. So apologies to other attorneys that may be listening to this. But that training was foundational for me and I loved it. I've spent my career in and around the biotech sector, really focused on innovation, entrepreneurship, and strategy. The first part of my career was doing think tank and advocacy activities for kind of biotechnology, innovation, advising kind of international governments, national governments, even state or regional on kind of models of effective innovation entrepreneurship. Fell in love with the space between kind of university research and technology development and startups and companies that are licensing in technologies in the life sciences biotech space, and wanted to help build an ecosystem. So I came to UNC Chapel Hill here in North Carolina to work for Eshelman Innovation. I'm currently their chief strategy officer, and I also have a role in their School of Pharmacy as associate dean. My role for them is very similar. It's innovation, entrepreneurship, and strategy, and we focus on therapeutic and digital health development.
Awesome. Love it. Well, we'll have a lot to talk about, and I think you have a lot of background to draw upon. So when it comes to this concept of innovation, right, sometimes it doesn't seem like a perfect fit when it comes to like church leadership or just being in a religious context where, innovation is for the, for the secular world or for business and those things. But how do you maybe set the framing for this concept of innovation in a church leadership discussion?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it really goes back to the beginning of the Restoration. You have Joseph Smith as kind of a prime innovator, right, in his time of coming from very humble origins to launching a global church. And it's been great in the Come Follow Me this year to kind of take that lens on everything that was going on as they're figuring things out for the first time, but also leaning heavily on direct revelation from the Lord. And that revelation always follows, right, some sort of event that's happening, right? Some problem that they're trying to solve, some prophecy that they're trying to fulfill. And so I think it's embedded in the roots of our church, this concept of innovation, and it plays out in a lot of different ways. I think President Nelson, it's certainly a time to be have this podcast. We're recording on the same day as his memorial, and I look at his legacy that he's left behind, and all the innovation that he and the apostles and others during his time as prophet, seer, and revelator. I mean, think about all the changes that we've been talking about in the church, all the innovation he's brought forward, and you can go back to Jesus Christ, right? I mean, I think as we think about innovation and what we mean by that, we typically define that as something novel that has that has value to someone that's willing to pay for it in a very kind of business school definition frame. But as you apply it to the gospel of Jesus Christ, it is this frame of how do we continue to evolve. And this is the last dispensation of the fullness of times. And what does that mean as the restoration continues on?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm curious, like, especially you probably see this in the business world where, you think of Apple computers today, a lot different than Apple computers when Steve Jobs was, in his garage, trying to figure that out. Right. And I think, in Joseph Smith's time, there's maybe more room to try some different things, or maybe he had more autonomy to say, yeah, let's do this or that. And obviously there was revelation involved and things being established, but it seemed like there was a little more wiggle room to be innovative, where now we're kind of in this institutional church, just like Apple's now sort of this huge organization that with different departments and a lot of opinions and bureaucracy is seeped in there to some extent. And so is there something to consider as far as a larger organization? Like, does a larger organization have a harder time staying innovative?
I think the answer, based on the data, or at least the way that I see the data, is clearly yes, or at least as we think about big breakthrough innovations, right? We certainly are past the days of somebody standing up as Steve Jobs did and said, I'm going to put a computer in your pocket, right? To the incremental, next version of the iPhone, right? I think all of that's innovation. And we certainly can talk about innovation frameworks and different kinds of innovation. But so I think it does evolve as the organization gets bigger. The kinds of innovation tend to be quarterly driven, kind of by no surprises for people in the business world. But, in a church like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I think that they have the same problems as every large organization does for creating breakthrough innovations. That's why startups exist, right?
Yeah.
To kind of solve for that problem. But I also think that, all the large corporates are trying to continue to solve this problem. I think the last 3 years, CEO surveys of the top, Fortune 200, 500, innovation is always a top 3 priority for them. So it's still a problem they're trying to solve. And, quite frankly, I think that, it's still something we're trying to figure out in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's a lot of it that happens that goes unnoticed. And I think the structure of the church, interestingly enough, the autonomy that stakes and wards and even individuals have when we're, invited to go out and do good, right? To not be commanded in all things. So that to me is an innovation imperative, right? When we have that creates even, podcasts like this, right? Or Zion's Lab or other things that are going out that are popping up that are complementary to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that help drive that mission forward. And so I see it as an and rather than an or, and it really is just how can we, whether we're in callings, how can we innovate within the frame of our calling? And what does that mean exactly when we say innovate? And how do we just do that as, whether, with the priesthood that we have, with the callings that we have, with the covenants we've made with God to do that, right? To continue the restoration.
Yeah. And I think just our structure is really unique, and, it's always fun to maybe compare organization, like our religious organization, to a secular organization or business organization. I feel like an interesting experimenter. You kind of learn some things from that contrast. But really, our approach is unique, where I think so often we, general members of the church will conflate the local church with the general church. And so we look to the institutional church to make changes, right? Or if we're unsettled about how things are going in our ward, we think, I wish the church, right, would just change that or update the handbook or do that differently. And, you think about, we shouldn't have 3-hour church. We should have 2-hour church. And the institutional church changed that. Like, oh, great. That's better. Right. At least some people think that. But really it's almost like we have a lot more autonomy than we realize in the local church and the local ward that we try and highlight here on Leading Saints. And so anytime I hear, as I'm in discussions of leadership in the church, I often hear people kind of orient themselves towards the institutional church saying, yeah, I wish it would be a little different. And I'm trying to reorient them like, no. If you do things locally, you have actually a lot of wiggle room, in the local church, when even with the following the handbook to the T, there's a lot of maybe a more of an entrepreneur spirit or approach that you can take with innovation on the local church rather than relying on the institutional church. Any thoughts come to mind?
Yeah,
How that?
100% aligned with that. And in my mind, in my callings, that's kind of the lens that I've taken. I always encourage people, very creative people, like they tend to run into stuff because they come up with great ideas and then they go in the handbook and be like, oh, dang, I can't do that. Right. Versus, actually there's a theory in innovation that talks about the primal mark. And there's some decent research around this, but it's essentially this idea that the hardest brushstroke on any painting is the first brushstroke. Once that brushstroke is given, then the picture kind of, and the creativity process becomes simpler and it gets going. And I've often encouraged people, no, actually start with the handbook. It's actually easier to start there with exactly the frame you're describing of, hey, everything's not going to be spelled out. It really is a principle-based approach if you read it in the way that I think it's intended, with some clear guardrails, right, around things that can get us in trouble or get the church in trouble, et cetera, right? And those guardrails are important. But, we often think in entrepreneurs, I think, know this, right, that constraints can be helpful, right? It sharpens your strategy. It sharpens where you focus your creative powers and innovation to really launch all sorts of things. And the way we often talk about how similar, you go to a church in Zimbabwe or in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and there's so many things that are the same. And I think my journey and the research we've done that's culminated in this book that we just released is really about, actually, there's a lot of variation that we have a lot to learn from each other, right? That there's a lot of people in Southeast Asia that the way that they approach worshiping the gospel of Jesus Christ, we have a lot to learn from them, right? There's lots of things that we can bring back and continue to innovate around that can really bless our lives. And we forget that sometimes that differentiation, that diversity, pick the word you want to use, is something that we can learn from that'll enrich our lives as we innovate here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Yeah. I appreciate that framing of like the handbook or like the institutional direction where, of course, we want to follow the handbook and it has a strong purpose of existing, but I love the framing of it's a good place to start the first stroke, right? I'm just thinking of, and this happens, you hear these stories of like somebody who's just has a few months or a year or so in the church and suddenly they're the branch president in Africa, right? And they don't have this decades of experience to seeing how the Sunday worship service is done over and over again. And so luckily they have that handbook to say, here's the guidelines of how you do a worship service, right? And it's that starting. And then as they get going, they get comfortable with those routines, then they can start to try some things. Again, not to go against the handbook, but to realize there's a lot you can do within the handbook with that innovation.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Cool. So help us, like, where's a good starting point when we just think about the local church, a bishop, a police society president, elders quorum president, who, do they need to be innovative? Like, can't they just make sure the doors are unlocked, the lights are on, turned on, and, make sure everything, happens? Why should they consider this concept of innovation?
Yeah, well, certainly the one thing I want everybody to get out of this podcast is that they have more work to do if you're a leader in the church. So, and unfortunately, and of course I'm joking, but unfortunately, that's always the challenge with any kind of conversation, right? And I think that's why quality improvement processes are feel a little bit more comfortable, right? Like, hey, like we're just going to make the 1% improvement talk, which I absolutely love, right? About, improving the bike, as you may recall, in various places, 1% at a time. It's a great way to get momentum. It's a great way to get going and move forward. And I think and there's lots of places in the church where that's exactly the approach we should take. Innovation processes, frameworks, if you want to define innovation as new technology, right? That, and I think the research is pretty clear on this in, books like Good to Great by Jim Collins and others, that innovation, technology, that is there to serve strategy, right? Strategy comes first. Then there's the optimization, quality improvement kinds of stuff that's important. But then there's this whole domain of innovation where we just kind of say, hey, look, like before we improve this, 10% or 1% at a time, is there a better way of doing this altogether? Right? Can we take a step back and rethink this problem and come at it and kind of have that computer in your pocket moment, right? Of, hey, like, do we need to do 3-hour church? Like, can we do this in 2? Right? That's not improving things by 1%, right? That's at least 33% by my calculation. So, in my mind, I think there's lots of spaces for innovation in your callings, regardless of where you are. And again, you kind of start with where you are. You have those improvements and say, hey, I can teach this a little bit better. But there's those moments in time where you're saying, hey, I'm trying to better reach, I'm a seminary teacher. I'm trying to better reach these seminary kids. And if I make this lesson 1% better, great. If I can fundamentally throw out the lesson plan and go down, our frameworks that we've been trained on and go down a question that was asked, right? We're in an innovation space now. We're not in how do I deliver the material a little bit better? So I think there's lots of situations that we may not recognize where we're drawing on that creativity. We're drawing on that pure revelation through the Holy Ghost to do something where there is no precedent. So that's, I think, in the reactive frame. And then in the proactive frame, there's all these things that, JustServe is probably another great example of this, right? Of an innovation frame of, hey, what if we apply technology to serve something in our communities, right? To provide this infrastructure for community service. That's not just for us, right? That's for an entire community, right? Or BYU Pathways, another great example. That's an incredible innovation in my book. That's not incremental at all, right? They're delivering to 80,000 students around the world, 3 years bachelor's. So people in Africa that are getting U.S. quality education online. They're at the forefront of online learning at this point. They're competing against the University of Phoenixes and all those that are, trying to race to that front edge of that asynchronous learning as we talk about in universities. So there's, whether it comes at the top down or whether it comes into ideas of how to better engage youth in a seminary class or in a youth activity, there are lots of places for innovation, in my opinion.
Yeah. Another thought, I guess, to add to this discussion is that, it's easy when we talk about innovation to think of it in the context of a business, an organization, a church, a ward, which I think is interesting to explore and talk about. But also, like, there can be innovation. This is why we call our online community Zion Lab, right? We are looking for individual Zion builders who want to come share their ideas, perspectives that'll help build Zion or build the kingdom of God, right? And we even go to the temple and covenant to use our time, talents, and everything that God's blessed us with for the building of the kingdom of God, right? And so, to me, this is more of like, I guess I don't want to get people stuck in this mindset of, oh, well, the bishop will need to innovate, or the stake president or whomever, but it's like all members of the church are actually invited into this relationship of innovation to build the kingdom. Like, what do you have to give? And let's try some things. And there's example after example of not only members of the church innovating in their own, in their own way, similar to leading saints, or there's so many other charitable efforts and things that members are doing, but also things that then were adopted by the institutional church, like primary, like Sunday school, like seminary. Like, these were all started by individual members who saw themselves as a design builder and saying, actually, I'm going to innovate. I think there's a better way to do this. Let's try it. And then it's like, oh, that's a good idea. Let's absorb that and keep it going. Right. So any other thoughts as far as who's involved with innovation?
Yeah. For me, innovation, when you kind of adopt a frame of innovation, is really creation, right? Mm-hmm. That is fundamental to who we are as children of God, right? As the divine creator, right? And again, anything not, if you define innovation as novelty that, fulfills, I said, that somebody wants to pay for, right? But if you kind of, in a nonprofit or in a kind of mission-driven organization, we'll substitute somebody want to pay for to divine purpose or mission of the organization. right? So something that's novel, that drives a divine purpose, which is, to God, bringing past the immortality and eternal life of man. If that's our frame, I mean, there's lots of ways. I mean, all the way down to how do I love my neighbor, right? At an individual level, how do I do that better? There's lots of different ways that we can come up with in sharing our talents and our creative power to do that, to innovate, to more structured things kind of outside of a church kind of organization, right? And you just gave a lot of great examples of that. And I think there's plenty of room. Again, we're commanded to go about doing good, right?
Yeah.
And we fulfill our callings, and we need to make sure that there's ample time and attention for that. But there is a lot of space for us to do that. I mean, you look at another great example, the Michigan church shooting, right? It was just a regular member that started up the GoFundMe or whatever the platform was, for the family of the shooter, right? Perfect example of it, of innovation right there, right? Take a known technology to serve a purpose. It's novel, right? Novel idea. And, think about all of the articles, all the press around that, and how many like emails I got, or people that sent me messages about, wow, that was really amazing, right? So I think that's we have more innovative capacity and power than we think we have. I think we start with our church callings, but we need to think beyond those. And in an ideal world, you start to kind of overlap those a little bit if you can. We think about that in missionary work frames, right? Of inviting your youth leader, get your neighbor to come teach a class in the classic Clayton Christensen, grandfather of innovation kind of a way. I mean, he was talking about innovation frameworks when he put out that The Power of Everyday Missionary book.
Yeah,
that's all innovation based, right? So there is lots of room for us to bring that divine gift that we all have.
yeah. Yeah, and speaking of, Clay Christensen or some of the other, business thought leaders, the examples are given because there's this feeling of like, if you don't innovate, like your industry will be disrupted, right? And there's, so many examples of, from Blockbuster Video and how Netflix disrupted them and so forth. And sometimes I wonder, from a church standpoint, it's easy to get into this place of like, oh, well, we can't be disrupted, right? We can't, it's not like, oh, a competing ward opened down the street and it's really cool. No, that's not going to happen because we're so structured and we're an institutional church. Where, you look at the Protestants where, yeah, there can be another church that opens up down the street and wow, that looks more appealing. Why don't we start going there? Right. And so they feel that tension a little bit of,
right,
but we really should keep innovating because we could be disrupted where we're, maybe numbers shrink in a ward and we just sort of combine with another ward thinking, well, demographics are shifting. We don't see it as oh no, like something's happening here. So is there anything to that? Like why
yeah.
should we make sure we're innovating so we're not disrupted, but sometimes we feel protected from that as a church,
Yeah, I mean, I do, there is a kind of, no unhallowed hand kind of feeling that we lean on a lot, right?
Yeah.
So to your point, and that's certainly true, right? I think where I don't think the disruption happens at the institutional level as much as it happens at the individual level. And so if you think about, the power of, let's just say, the internet and what that's done and how people antagonistic to the church really got out ahead of members of the church, right? And the church writ large to tell the narrative of, and quite frankly, just spread falsehoods, right? About the church, our doctrine, our history, et cetera. And kind of how innovative they were, right? I mean, that caused a lot of disruption and not all of it necessarily bad, right? I mean, I think the way that we talk about church history now is just one example because of some of what's happened. And how much more we know about church history and what that spawned as far as better understanding our history, Joseph Smith Paper Project, all of those things. I think institutionally, yeah. I mean, but I would say, yeah, absolutely, that was a disruption to how we live and how we, how our children are impacted, right, by things outside of our church, and maybe a way that's not so positive, right, to put it kindly. And so I think when we think about, and that's again to your point about institutional innovation, I think the church has done a lot of things. And then again, podcasts like yours, projects like Zion Lab, and many others kind of have followed that and kind of said, okay, look, I can do something on my own on social media. And I think, again, to the point of there's plenty of room, for groundswell innovation. It's actually being encouraged, right? President Nelson pushed, right, our generation of people to use technology, right, to use these disruptions to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, to start telling a different narrative to us. And so I think and this is kind of part of my more recent research and part of what the book's focused on, is not just how can we innovate, but how do we actually follow the prophet in unlocking innovation in others? What kind of environment do we need to create, especially as church leaders, so that people don't feel like, oh, if I don't get Bishop's permission to start this blog, or, whatever that looks like, that you feel compelled to do that, are we creating that environment, right? As inadvertently as leaders, where we may be putting barriers up to innovation and not giving people the tools, or even just the support, or as President Nelson did, the kind of direction, prophetic direction, to say, no, don't wait for the church to tweet, right? Or don't wait for the church to engage on social media. Go out there, go do that, be innovative, try it out, figure it out. And I think that's one of the great, legacies of President Nelson.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate that so much of, unintentionally being an award, we can kind of get into the state of mind of like, well, they need me to do something. They got my number, they can call me. I'm happy to help, but whatever the bishop wants to do, or, even an award council setting of like, yeah, it's very innovative as long as the bishop comes up with the innovation, right? He's excited about it. But to really, a part of innovation, as you said, is really enabling others to invite them into a space of creativity, of inspiration, and say, yeah, let's try some things, right? And I've seen this in awards where someone maybe approaches a bishopric member and says, hey, I'm thinking of, could I do this class about family history, or could I do this class about, faith concerns or whatever? It's like, yeah, let's try it out. Let's see if people respond. And sometimes it didn't really go well, so let's pivot and try something else. But to create a culture where people can feel like, I have an idea, and I think the bishop or bishopric will actually listen to me if I bring it up to him.
100%. And, and that's a proactive process, right? Like, you have to create a culture at whatever level you are in, right? Whether you're the bishop, the elders quorum president, we study president, or just a mother or father in a home, right, with your own children. That's a cultural thing, right, that we're talking about. And, maybe this is a good time to kind of talk very high level to start anyway, about some of these principles of enabling innovation and others. We, in our recent book, we talked about five principles of innovation. And the first is recognize potential. And I think in an LDS setting, this is understanding that, hey, look, my 7-year-old is a child of God with divine potential.
Yeah.
So her creative capacity may be a little bit more than I'm giving her credit for as a 7-year-old. And so in the gospel setting, in the book, we talk about it in frames of the African-American community and the history of innovation, entrepreneurship in the African-American community. And we can dive into some of that. But that first principle is really recognizing potential of all the people around you, right? The innovative capacity, that divine inheritance that people have. The second principle is all about power of enclaves. And again, we can come back to these, but this is the idea that, awards, whether it's a ward or whether it's, whatever group that people kind of start to pull towards, that's incredibly important for this unlocking this innovative potential, this entrepreneurial potential, for a lot of reasons that have to do with the courage and the ability to take risks and having support. And the great example you gave, Kurt, around starting a new class. Talk about enabling ownership is a third principle, where how do you actually fully enable or empower, whether it's a person on a calling or just somebody with a new idea, to go out there and go do it and try it. First is really looking at unique lenses. So when we talk about kind of helping people get that first primal brushstroke going, what is it about their experience, their training? What is it unique to them that they're really going to bring a different view or different lens to a temple prep class, or to, a blog, or to, whatever YouTube channel? And how do we actually empower that and bring that out and make that part of the innovation, rather than trying to pull them away from what might make them different, right? To make it more standard. And then finally, we talk about acceleration, and really simply put, how do we put fuel on the fire, right? How do we actually snowball this innovation and accelerate things so that we can, instead of reacting a few years later, right, to people that are a bit ahead of us that may be disrupting various people in the church, how do we actually get ahead of it, right? How do we actually do much of what's being done today?
Yeah. So to review, those are the 5 principles are recognizing potential, the power of enclaves, enable ownership, empower each unique lens, and accelerate transformative change. Maybe let's dive into each one of these a little bit further with recognizing potential. I mean, that kind of seems like an easy one. Like, yes, I recognize that there's some potential in this room or we could be better, but I'm just thinking in a context of like the restored church sometimes, and I appreciate like, Elder Uchtdorf's talk from years ago that it's an ongoing revelation or ongoing restoration, right? Like we're not done yet. Everything's not restored. Like there's still a lot more to consider. But it's easy to get a place of like, you know what? We got ourselves a temple down the street. We got a building, and every week we have services, and we're loving each other. We have great activities every year. Like, what more needs to be done? Is there like, should a leader maybe try and push themselves into this place of like never being satisfied with where they're at?
Yeah, I mean, it's a thin line between that and kind of this eternal progression concept that we've committed to, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
and I think it is so easy to, kind of be comfortable, right? And in our wards and our congregations and just, put our focus elsewhere. And we have to prioritize, right? That's the strategy side of innovation, quite frankly. We have to make choices about where we're going to spend our time and our effort and where we want to grow. But I think this idea of what often happens though is we get comfortable and, somebody will walk up to us and say, hey, I've been thinking about X, right?
hmm
And our first reaction often is exactly as you described. Let's not upset the apple cart, right? We've got a good thing going, right? Of, hey, I'm a business person, you're an academic, right? Like you're going to see things different. This is going to be hard work to really support you. And so in this frame, like we're automatically throwing up barriers, right? Of like, here's all the reasons it won't work.
Yeah,
That tends to be a very human response. And across the board, we obviously see it in the frame of diversity as we thought about the African American experience. But what we don't realize, and I'll tell a quick story. Madam
yeah,
C.J. Walker, who some of you may know, she was an African American born right after slavery, and basically had every reason to fail. Orphaned at 7, married at 14, first child as a teenager, first husband dies at 18, not educated. She has this experience. She ends up moving, and she has this experience where because of bad nutrition and water, her hair starts falling out in clumps. And she actually invents a kind of a hair salve, a hair product that solves the problem. There's nothing that exists currently. And so she kind of has this dire circumstance. She gets help along the way. Somebody sees her potential. She learns more about the kind of beauty business and then goes and launches an empire. And she actually becomes the first self-made female millionaire in the US, not the first Black self-made female millionaire, the first self-made female millionaire in the US. So
wow,
it's this idea that, and people, if you were to look at something like her at the beginning, you're just thinking, yeah, hey, you've got this idea. There's just no way. Here's all the reasons why this is going to fail. And recognizing potential is actually forcing yourself to stop that instinct and just to listen, right? And just say, hey, wait a minute. There's something about this individual, again, that divine capacity that everybody has to say, hey, like, let's take a step back, right? And think about this and actually do this. So I'll use an example from the scriptures. I just read Alma 24 today, right? With the Anti-Nephi-Lehis, right? A group of people that grow up outside the church, if you will, right? They get brought in. And there's this interesting language as they start to bury their weapons of war, where the author is trying very hard to make it clear that nobody was telling them to do this, right?
Hmm.
That the language is really interesting. It was, in fact, I think I have it right here. It being, in their view, a testimony to God. So them bearing their weapons of war was, in their view, a testimony to God and man that they were committed to this. God was not asking them to do this. But again, like in that story, apologies, I'm getting a bit emotional, but that story coming to today, I mean, that's how you get the Michigan response, right? That, I mean, we see it in other culture. The Amish have done something similar. AME churches in South Carolina, like this is, but that, I mean, that's a Christian, that's a God thing, right? And that comes from these kinds of messages that are laced, this kind of innovation, right? Like this was out of the normal. No, just come over here. We'll move you over here, right? Or hey, just fight. You can defend yourself, right? That's kind of the optimization thing. This is a fundamentally different group of people, have a completely different perspective on the problem, and have this innovative solution, which, by the way, converts so many of their Lamanite brethren, right? That's the impact that they would not have happened had they just defended themselves, right?
Yeah.
So in my mind, that's the power of innovation. That's the power of recognizing potential that can come from these unique places that we, again, like, hey, like, let's think about all the barriers of why this is not going to work, to, hey, actually, okay, you look at the world very differently than me. I kind of want to hear this. Like there may, let me listen to this first before I jump into barriers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. That I think that's just sort of something to look out for as you strive to lean into innovation, is that, yes, of course, like you should expect that there's going to be a long list of reasons why such and such won't work, right? But we're staying in a mindset of seeing the potential and moving forward with faith, and maybe God will open some doors, or deeper revelation will be felt, and it'll be awesome to see that you overcome those reasons, just like the stories you shared, right?
100%.
Cool.
Would it be helpful to go to the next principle, Kurt, and dive down a little
Yeah,
bit?
this is one I'm not quite sure. Like, break down the power of an enclave.
Yeah. So this, the best story that I have on this, I mean, related to, again, coming from the frame of the African American community with me and my co-authors, was, there's a Wilmington, North Carolina. Those of you that've been out here to the east, it's on the ocean. It was a port town. A lot of things were shipped out of North Carolina, and so it was a fairly prosperous place. Overall, it was 55% of the population back in the 1800s, coming out of slavery, post-Civil War. 55% was African American. And what happened was that in a period of the same generation, African Americans went from slavery to upper and middle class in a way that I can't really see a lot of parallels anywhere else in history. And that's primarily because of entrepreneurship. So they took the skills that they had and they were able to finally own their own labor, right? And start to launch their own businesses. Unfortunately, the story has a tragic ending. In 1898, there was what can only be described in my mind as a coup d'etat, where kind of in the rise of the KKK and the swelling of kind of those messages, there was a massacre, and 60 to 300 people were destroyed, and all of the Black businesses were destroyed, and so generational wealth was lost. And the reason it's 60 to 300 people is that it wasn't really talked about until about 10 years ago. So this is one of those stories that was kind of buried and has come to light more recently. But what is kind of lost in the tragedy is this idea that there was this enclave or this group of people that were able to leverage their entrepreneurial skills, their innovation, and work together to create something in spite of the barriers, that it kind of points to there's something special about enclaves. And this is somewhat intuitive. I think the Latter-day Saints, we have wards, right, for a reason. We don't do everything at home, in our families. We can kind of understand it more generally. So some of it's intuitive, but what I think is lost is that the reason enclaves are really powerful is that, risk taking in an enclave is supported, right? In an ideal world, you have the capital support, you have the expertise around you, you have, the ability to kind of, you start to see other people taking risks and doing, businesses. And so you start to do that. And, there's a lot of that kind of happens informally, right, within our congregations. But this idea, when we talk about a Zion lab, right, and thinking about how do we build Zion, if you look at the early church, you see similar parallels, right? Look at Kirtland, look at Nauvoo, look at Missouri, right? Same tragic endings, right? In Nauvoo, Missouri in particular, but we often take Nauvoo. I mean, it was bigger than Chicago, right, at the time,
Yeah.
right? They went from nothing, from swamps, right, to this, and that was part of I would, as kind of outside of a church lens, I would say, yeah, that was because of their entrepreneurial spirit and the innovation that they were driving there and how they organized themselves. You could point to all these little things that they did differently than society that enabled, that was different, that was innovative, right, than how frontier towns were built, that helped them accelerate very quickly in a short period of time into what Nauvoo became. And then you see it again in the Salt Lake Valley, right? It happens just over and over again. And so sometimes we kind of say, oh yeah, well, the church is going to go away in the next life, right? And we'll have a different structure. And so how, the church is kind of the best we got. And I think sometimes we underappreciate the value of
Yeah.
church.
Yeah.
We've understood it post-COVID in a like social frame. But when we think about innovation in particular, the church can be an incredibly enabling environment.
Yeah. That's powerful. So when it comes to these enclaves, this is like almost like being in a support group, because if you're on your own trying to innovate, because of all the opposition you may feel, you'll maybe give up sooner than you would unless you're in it. More of an enclave. Is that a fair way to frame it?
Yeah, I think that's right. Right. It's that kind of broader support, but also just, I mean, well, the great saying that revelation is spread out among us, right? And we think
Yeah.
about that in council settings. But if you sit down with your Relief Society or your elders quorum, and our elders quorum president says, hey, this regular member of my elders quorum had this great idea about what we could do in the community, right? We'd like to talk about that, right? What do you all think? We think this is a great idea. We think it's not, but we think we can make it better, right? That we can together, we can improve this idea. And then all of the expertise around that Relief Society room or elders quorum or that youth, that 14, 15-year-old young women's class or whatever, like all of a sudden, everybody starts to bring their own talents to the table,
Mhm.
right? And then it's like you don't just have the support, like the emotional support, you have expertise, you have human capital now, right? And you have the support of a small meager ward budget, right? In some way, shape, or form. So that's this enclave power that some of it happens naturally, but I think if we were more intentional about enabling that, regardless of kind of how we're engaged or where we are in the church, whether it's even a seminary class, whatever it might be, are we thinking about how do we enable this group, however you define it, to do something beyond, right, to actually drive an innovative idea, program, etc.
Yeah. And I would imagine, like, I'm just thinking if somebody has an innovative idea, maybe and they're just uh, an everyday member, they don't necessarily find themselves on the ward council or anything. Sometimes we take this idea to the ward council or to the bishopric, hoping that they'll champion that idea and move it to the next level. When in reality, you almost want to build a team of advocates or that enclave of a group of individuals who want to do that. So in this way, you're not dumping it on the ward council saying, go make this happen because it's a good idea, but you're maybe more saying, actually we have a team here. We'll go do it with your blessing. And that that can, bring more strength to an innovative idea.
Yeah. And that, I mean, that's the perfect bridge into that next principle of enabling
Yeah.
ownership, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you just described it perfectly, where it's this idea of, how do I, I'm the person that comes up with the idea. If I'm doing it by myself, I'm getting scared real quick, right? But if I've got that kind of a few people that I know can help me, in some cases, it does make sense to have institutional support, right? To have the
Yeah.
church support, right? The elders quorum president, society president, whatever it may be. And so that those leaders turning around and saying, hey, like sometimes it's like, don't dump it on us. We're going to dump it back on you. That's not what we're talking about, right? Like what we're
Yeah.
talking about is this is an amazing idea. You are perfectly positioned to do this along with the people that you've mentioned. How do we help you, right?
Yeah.
What can we do to support you? What resources do you need, right? And so what can we do to move this forward? And I think that's a powerful moment in an entrepreneur's journey. And it's just like getting that first venture check or just getting that, support on you put yourself out there, even in a corporate setting for a new idea, and you get that leadership support and they open up the budget, right? And there's like, just tell us what you need. Let's go do this, right? that ability to feel like you own the kind of the idea, you feel like you own the execution of that idea. So it drives accountability downstream, which is important for successful execution. And also there's this feeling of like, oh yeah, I get to, in a startup world, it's like we put equities on cap tables, right? And say, okay, yeah, we can easily reflect the value you're bringing because I can point to a number of shares that you own. So in a church, it's not that easy, right? We have to be thoughtful about, it's not so much because people aren't doing it necessarily for the recognition. So there's not a cap table equivalent or something in a corporate setting that's a promotion or et cetera. But I think most people, when they have an innovative idea, particularly in the gospel of Jesus Christ, is like, hey, look, like I just want to have impact, right? Like I'm trying to help.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes we interpret that in ways of like, oh, they're trying to gun to be the next bishop, or they're, like we kind of do that sometimes unintentionally. And I think people generally don't, that's not their heart. Right. And so I think that's when we kind of turn that back around, and I think we recognize that, I was like, oh, okay, great. And so, real quick story, Joe Louis, for those of you who know the famous boxer, he's famous because he beats Max Schmeling in the lead up to the World War II, and Max was Hitler's boxer, right? And so he became a national celebrity, but he dies poor because he can't convince the Ford family to give him a dealership so that he can sell cars. And the reason why is they reached out to owners and they say, no, we don't want to give him ownership because he's Black. Max Schmeling, who actually wasn't a Nazi, even though he was Hitler's boxer, he gets the Coca-Cola franchise. Joe dies poor, Max dies rich.
Oh, wow.
Right. So, and we use that as a stark example of like the power of ownership in an innovation entrepreneurship setting. But, when people in our wards, when their hearts are in that frame that I was describing of, hey, they just want to build the kingdom, right? Yeah. They just want to build Zion. And we do things that don't, if we kind of get that wrong and encouraging them, that's how you get people checked out in your ward, right? That's how you get people like, I'm going to wait for the bishop, right? I'm going to wait for the whatever. My hand's been slapped, right? Like, I don't want to be innovative anymore. I don't want to try anything new because I got shot down last time. So just tell me what to do, bishop, right? I mean, I think that's what we're trying to avoid. But if we get this ownership piece right, in particular, then the energy is entirely different, right? And the innovation just comes.
Yeah. That's such a tricky dynamic where, when people disengage from an organization, like that's such a killer of culture,
Right.
Positive culture that can drive so much beauty and it's remarkable what can happen when you dial in the culture there. And I often wonder, I worry, our religious experience is sometimes overly structured where it's like, listen, he's got the keys, so we're going to listen to him for the next 5 years or whatever. Like it can, and not that that was intended, but I often see individuals maybe step out of the context of the church and go to a cool charity thing or start a movement in the community, which are all good. And I wouldn't, discourage them from any of that. But I also wonder if they felt like they had to disconnect their creative, innovative mind from the church because it felt like, oh, there's no place. I can't even, breathe in here. There's no way where to room, no room to wiggle, for those things. But anyways, that's something for a leader maybe step back and think, do I enable, that innovation a little bit to make it easier,
100%. Right. And I think, and those are the exact questions in my mind and the answer may be no, actually they had the opportunity. They just chose not to, and that's okay. Yeah. But yeah. I think just taking that beat, right. To say, hey, like, did I discourage this somehow inadvertently? And then what can I do? Right. In a true kind of mode of improvement and repentance that we all have to do like all the time. Right. That what can we do to bring that back and bring that and kind of get people engaged. And quite frankly, it's often in the innovation space. If you have people that are checked out, there's many of them, at least in my experience in the various leadership positions that I've been in, that it's a great way to get people re-engaged. It's just saying, hey, look, like you're disengaged, like we think you'd be great in this calling. And not just because we're trying to get you, of course we want you back at church, right? You belong at church, you belong with us. But here's what I know about you, right, and your background. And here's a special lens that you bring that nobody else has. right? That is going to be hugely valuable to us. And I want to do everything that I can to help you in that lens. And that really kind of drives at this next principle of empowering each unique lens, particularly those that scale. And I mean, there's so many examples that I think you guys can think about where you get that inspiration about a calling, you have a conversation and you have that, you talk to them. And if you can tie that to, hey, I want you to teach on Sunday this lesson because I know this is part of your past, right? And if you feel comfortable sharing some parts of that, that's going to be incredibly powerful for the members of our Relief Society, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a simple assignment, right? That to bring somebody in that might be disengaged, recognizing they have a unique lens and doing something to empower it, right? And bringing them in, giving them the ownership as we described. And there's so many issues in a ward that we need to, problems that we're trying to solve at scale across the whole ward, whether it's being more united, right? We're always talking about how can we be more united or how do we better minister? And so when we feel stuck and need that innovation, we tend to go to the same 10 people rather than thinking about, you know what, there's this sister, or there's this brother, right? Or I have a neighbor who's not a member of the church at all, who's got this great experience, great background, great whatever, right? And let me go see if I can talk to them. Let me see if they'd be open to that. That's incredibly powerful and enabling, and really recognize again that divine potential that we each have.
Yeah. And I love the concept of the unique lenses where because in a ward, you're going to have different, there's certain minority groups as far as like maybe how they see the gospel or how they, just their circumstances of life make them a little bit different than maybe the type of people who are on a ward council. Right. And to figure out how to consider those perspectives and lenses so that we can really serve the greater whole rather than kind of serving the same 10 people, like you said, right?
That's right. Well, and then we get maybe to the, what Paul had described as the body of Christ, right? I think if you use these kinds of frames of, then wards become powerful, right? Communities become powerful. Elders, quorums, relief societies, pick your level of enclave or group, or even down to the individual level. Zion's lab becomes powerful, right? Is this idea of you're truly leveraging the innovative potential across the organization. It doesn't mean you're chasing every new idea, by the way. That's why we say, look for unique lenses that can scale, that you solve big problems that are important or that are strategic for your organization, however you define that organization. But people have creative powers and experiences that can help you solve problems. So sometimes it is aligning, hey, here's my ward strategy for the year, whatever you might call it, ward goals or elders quorum goals or family goals, right? And say, okay, how does each member of my family, like what lenses do they bring that can really help drive this? That's going to drive our whole family, right? Versus, hey, let's chase every new idea because, it will be really fun and cool. That's a great way to get burned out in the innovation frame. Strategy is really important. And so it is attaching unique lens to strategic goal.
Perfect. Anything else with accelerate transformative change to round it out, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think just on that piece, it really is just, when we start doing those 4 pieces and it starts coming, you're going to start to feel that momentum, that innovation flywheel that we're all trying to go after, where you have the incremental stuff happening, the quality improvement, and there's people that are really good at that and they can do their thing and be successful. But you're really bringing everybody to the table to solve, to build the kingdom, right? In very simplistic terms. And, there's great stories we can talk about in that frame of how people are doing that in the innovation space. But it really is just, okay, once you start getting good at this, you have to double down and go faster. And I think the assumption, particularly when we're trying to engage people that are on the margins of the church or may have different backgrounds or may have different educational backgrounds, right, is that we often have this assumption of like, it's going to take a generation or it's going to take 5 or 6 years, right, to kind of get everybody up to speed. And I think that's an important exercise, right? I'm not going to burn myself out and have realistic expectations, right, and realistic goals. But you have to counter that. You have to weigh that against am I going too slow, right? Do we have enough urgency here, right? I mean, you look at Joseph Smith, you look at President Nelson. I mean, how many temples he announced? Like he wasn't, he wasn't waiting, right? Like he was pouring fuel on the fire of, we're going to do we're going to do a lot of temples. And if we've got to invent modular temples to go faster, we're going to invent modular temples to go faster. If we've got to announce those temples before we've even bought the property, we're going to announce, because this is revelation. The Lord's telling us to go faster. And so I feel like we are just in this moment of time right now, and in this last dispensation where the Lord is kind of challenging us. President Nelson said, take your vitamins, right? I love that about him, right? It's like, it's going to be a little tiring, but you got to remember that on the other side of that tiring, innovation gives a lot of energy, right? That oftentimes we get burned out of stuff that isn't strategic and that, is failing or whatever, right? When we actually have that innovation wheel turning and people are engaged that haven't been engaged before, that drives incredible energy into an individual, into a ward, into whatever group. And then it becomes, then you're building Zion, right? You're building Nauvoo, you're building the West, right? We look back at these examples of people that have incredible energy, or even today, President Nelson, 101, and he was going strong to the very end. I think it's this innovative spirit, right? That drove that energy and helped people feel less tired.
That's a great point. And I'm just thinking of, you consider, we've all probably seen it, a brand new bishopric, right? The week after they're called, it's sort of their first Sunday. Like, consider the energy that you feel coming from them. They have a new purpose. They have, they have a task. They have something that's really worth showing up to church and be involved in doing the things. Like, if we can multiply that type of energy so that everybody felt like, yeah, like I have a place here, like I'm doing something, I'm contributing, I'm innovating, and that energy is undeniable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, tell us before we wrap up, Roy, tell us about the book, and if people want to really jump into some of this stuff, where'd you recommend they start?
Yeah, so our book is called Race to Innovation: Unleashing the Power of Entrepreneurship in Everyone. You can find that at www.racetoinnovation.net. .net is key. .com is a little expensive right now. So, but yeah, so that's where you can find more information about the book. I think really, wanted to come on this podcast less about the book, and I think really this journey for me started with President Nelson saying, "Hey, we need to lead. We need to build bridges." That's why I jumped into this particular project, even though it didn't really have anything to do with the church at the beginning. It was really about how do we understand. What can we learn from these communities that have innovated and been entrepreneurs when that shouldn't have been possible? And as I went along, just found so many parallels to the church. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of places you can go other than what you hopefully maybe Zion's Lab or other places where you can see what's going on from a church perspective as it relates to innovation. Certainly love to be part of that conversation going forward.
Awesome. Well, we would love to have you continue to contribute in some form in Zion Lab and keep these type of conversations going and share your research and perspectives for sure. As we turn to the audience here, does anybody have a specific question you'd like to ask?
There's maybe something in the chat. Where I'm scrolling down.
Oh, let's see here.
Maybe how do you shoot down a bad idea without shutting the member down?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Any thoughts?
Yeah, a great question, Ricky. Thank you for that. It is definitely an art. So, and I think it starts with relationship, right? I mean, you kind of, and I think a lot of it is, I'm hoping these principles are helpful, quite frankly, because it's this idea of when somebody's telling you an idea and you start with, okay, let me, like my first reaction is I've got, again, 5 reasons why this is probably a bad idea. So, but let me hold on, right? Let me suppress that initial reaction and just hear them out and ask questions about, well, what is it in your experience that, like, tell me more about your background. Like, why do you want to approach it this way, right? Do you have a particular experience that's making you see this problem differently than I do? And really trying to dive into kind of the why of what they're suggesting. And I think that's the part of, and really understanding what that innovation potential is coming from, what problem they're trying to solve. I mean, oftentimes we get an idea and it's just like, like I want to, light candles in the young women's room. Can I do that, Bishop? Right. And you're like, well, the handbook says, right. Like, I mean, I think sometimes that's how it comes to you though, as a leader or as a neighbor, as a friend. And that's just because people aren't trained like maybe I am or others to give a good pitch, right? Where you're saying, hey, you start with problem, right?
Yeah,
What
yeah,
problem are you trying to solve? Why is this solution better than others? Are there regulatory legal problems with this solution that you're gonna have to overcome, right? And in a startup frame, we're trained for that. And so I think in just the everyday, like somebody's got innovative capacity, I think start with trying to understand where they're coming from, what problem they're trying to solve. And then as you're kind of understanding, you're starting to understand those lenses and then trying to give compliments about how great this idea is, then ask them the regulatory legal compliance question. Great. So, hey, I noticed that the handbook says that we can't do candles. Is there another way that we can do this? Right. Now that I understand better, like why you want to do candles, like, is this a campfire thing, right? That we go to the park and do, right? I think that then you're kind of in this co-ideation mode with them.
Hmm.
And then you're kind of, you get this idea, you're not shooting them down, you're guiding them to a better place, and moving forward. And then, I recognize, having said all that, there's just some times where it's just like, hey, like, this isn't strategic for us. We've got to be able to say no. But let me tell you, brother or sister or whatever, there is nothing stopping you from doing this outside the context of the church.
yeah,
I think this is a great idea. You invite your friends over, right? If you want to have a conversation about that, like, go for it, right? I mean, it's not a church sponsor activity, right? Because there's handbook or other problems. But, go for it, right? I mean, I don't, like, you'll learn, you'll get better, right? I just, we can't associate the church with it for the following reasons. But so I think that it's that kind of approach. Hopefully that's helpful, Kurt. I don't know if you have thoughts, or others
yeah.
do.
And I think it's worth recognizing there's just going to be practical restraints, right? Maybe you encourage your award or your organization to be innovative, and someone comes to you with an idea, and they're like, "And I'll just need $3,000 from the award budget to execute that." Well, we don't got $3,000 to just give you to try this idea, right? Or now we primarily aren't going to have an additional 3-hour meeting on Sunday in order to improve family history, or whatever it is. So I think then that's where it's like you can still build that culture, but still recognize, yeah, you're gonna have tough conversations, or we're gonna have to say, well, there's the constraints. You need to go back to the drawing board and figure this out, or maybe see if we can do this outside the context of the church organization, and maybe it's actual flourish better there. I know for me, if the and I know the church, as I interface with the communications department, they feel the same way. If the church came to me and said, "Great, Kurt, great what you're doing with leading saints. We would like to take it over and do it ourselves," I'd be like, "Well, you're not going to be able to move very fast, and we can have unique conversations here. It's probably not a good idea to do that because it flourishes better outside of the context of the institutional church, right?" And so I think there's going to be practical constraints that you're just going to have to talk through and figure out, and hopefully more inspiration comes.
Yeah. And just another shout out to Ricky. I think great other comments in there about, our stake presidency says our job is to implement, not innovate. And so, my response is like, okay. And he gives a perfect definition of what that means, of you can innovate how you implement. And that's going back to that primal brushstroke example, right?
Yeah.
You're given a constraint, but there is certainly a lot of freedom in my mind and how a lot of ways to implement, right? And innovate in your implementation. So I think but it's a balance, right? It is like, hey, we're not going to launch an entire, go a completely different strategic direction than the area presidency is encouraging us to go, which I think is the point. Apologies, Ricky, if I'm misstating
Yeah.
your point there. And then another great comment about, hey, how do this, where, innovation's about leadership, according to Steve Jobs, but we're also followers of Jesus Christ. So, and we're encouraged to be anxiously engaged. And I think that's quite frankly, I think every innovator kind of has to deal with that. It looks different in
Yeah.
our frame because at the end of the day, like, I can come up with something new that no customer cares about, right?
Right.
So there's your front end frame of okay, I have to follow something, right? I have to solve a problem that's relevant for someone. But at the same time, how I solve that problem then becomes, or whether it's implementation, how I innovate in implementation within the church, or even in the frame of, hey, my long-term destiny is to become like our Father in heaven, right? That is the seed that He's put in us. So maybe this is practicing that, right? And that this perfect, in my mind, this perfect balance of innovation and strategy, if you will, is this idea of what's our purpose: to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man, right? That's where we should be innovating. Yeah, and Ricky put it right there. Don't innovate just for the sake of innovation. Well said.
Yeah. And really, I think the more we should see constraints as a blessing, because that will stimulate further innovation and creativity rather than not having those constraints. So they're almost a welcome blessing in the long term. If it is a good idea or good innovation, it will survive the constraints. So
Yeah,
good stuff.
great thoughts.
Good stuff.
It's a tricky balance, guys, right? It really is. Yeah. It's hard, and this is where you'll lose some energy, but it's that you got to keep sticking with it, because once you find that balance, then it's the, hey, area presidency has directed me to go do this. This is the constraints that I have. Here's how I innovate. You're right. This is how I want to innovate it in my ward based on the people that I have that are ultimately going to implement this. Here's their unique lenses, right? We've got an enclave. We can do this. We are all in. This is, these are kind of the high level constraints. Great. Within this box, innovate like crazy, right? Have a great time. Let's do this. Let's get excited about this. And then, share out. Then it scales across, the stake, other wards, et cetera. That's what success looks like in my frame.
Yeah. Great discussion. This has been great, Roy. Again, we'll make sure we link to your book and everything if people really want to dive in head first and learn more about some of these concepts. Last question I have for you, Roy, is as you reflect on innovation and your research in this area, this will be maybe a question you never had before, maybe a silly question, but let's see what comes out of it. But how has being an innovator helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, and I always love that you asked this question at the end of your podcast, and somehow I forgot to think about that part for today. No, it comes back to divine potential, and we're on this earth to practice, right? And we're on this earth to practice innovating, creating, right? Learning how to do that with purpose, right? Aligned with God's will, which is the thing that's going to bring us most joy, right? At the end, as our prophet and apostles have continued to remind us. And so it is, obviously I drink the Kool-Aid on innovation. And so this is all I think about and talk about. And so I'm certainly biased, but that discipleship of Jesus Christ is actually thinking about how Jesus Christ himself innovated, right? He had clear directives from our Father in heaven, but how he taught, right? How he engaged, how he loved people, and that emulation is both in following what he did, but also in my mind, following the principles of what he was trying to teach us and come up with our own ways to love people in a 21st century frame, right? Of love, loving our neighbor and loving God.